The moment I walked into my apartment that bright afternoon, still holding a paper bag of groceries against my chest, my roommate came running from the hallway with eyes full of terror and said, "We need to pretend tonight." And before I could ask what she meant, before I could even close the door behind me, I saw the bruised suitcase in the middle of our living room, the child's red sneaker beside it, and the sunlight falling across a woman I had never seen before, sitting on our sofa like she had run out of every road in the world. My name was Niven Aurora, and until that day, I believed kindness was something small, something you gave in coins, smiles, and quiet favors. I did not know it could arrive like a storm, asking you to risk your safety, your comfort, and the simple life you had fought so hard to build. So before this story begins fully, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the kind of mercy that can change a person's whole life, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Ancient Truth. Your support helps stories like this reach hearts that may need them most. It was 3 in the afternoon, not night at all, when I came home from my shift at the bookstore. The day outside was warm and ordinary, the kind of day where traffic hummed softly, children laughed near the parking lot, and the sky over the city looked clean enough to forgive anyone. I had bought mangoes from the corner stall because my roommate, Syra Qureshi, had been sad all week and mangoes were the one thing that still made her smile. We were both 28, both tired in different ways, both living in a small apartment above a pharmacy where the elevator worked only when it felt generous. Our place had peeling paint near the windows, a kitchen sink that coughed in the mornings, and curtains Syra had stitched herself from old bedsheets. It was not beautiful to anyone else, but to us, it was proof that we had survived. Syra stood in front of me with her hands trembling. She was usually calm, the sort of woman who could fix a leaking pipe with a spoon and convince angry landlords to lower their voices. But that afternoon, her face had gone pale. Behind her, the stranger on our sofa clutched a little boy against her side. The boy could not have been older than 6. He had wide frightened eyes and hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. The woman's lip was split, one sleeve of her kurta torn, and her fingers were wrapped around the child's shoulder like she feared even the air might steal him away. Syra whispered that the woman's name was Meher, that the boy was her son, Ilyas, and that they had nowhere else to go. At first, I thought Syra had lost her mind. We were barely keeping ourselves afloat. Our rent was late by 6 days. The fridge contained half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, and now the mangoes. I had my own troubles, my own memories I kept locked away, my own father's angry voice still echoing from years ago whenever someone slammed a door. I wanted to be good, but goodness felt expensive, and I was tired of paying for everyone else's pain. Then Ilyas looked at the grocery bag in my arms and whispered that he had not eaten since morning. No one asked me to give him anything. No one had to. I placed the mangoes on the table, washed one, sliced it clumsily, and watched him eat like sweetness itself was something he had forgotten existed. The truth came slowly. Meher had run from her husband after years of hiding bruises under sleeves and fear behind polite smiles. That morning, while the sun was rising, he had thrown her phone against a wall and promised that by evening he would take Ilyas away from her forever. She had waited until he left, packed one suitcase, and fled to the Women's Help Center where Syra volunteered on weekends. But the shelter was full, and there was paperwork, and there were rules, and rules have a way of moving slowly when terror is moving fast. Syra brought them home because she said she could not leave them outside. Now Meher's husband was calling people, searching, threatening. And tonight, he might come looking. That was when Syra explained what she meant by pretending. Meher's husband had never met me, but he knew Syra volunteered at the center. If he came, we would pretend Meher and Ilyas were my visiting relatives from another city, pretend nothing was wrong, pretend our apartment was just another boring place in a building full of boring people. I wanted to refuse. The word no formed in my throat, heavy and reasonable. But then I saw Meher trying to straighten her torn sleeve, trying to look less broken in front of her son, and something in me cracked. I remembered my mother doing the same thing when I was a child, smoothing her dupatta over a bruise, telling me she had slipped, telling me to finish my homework while her hands shook over the stove. So we prepared in daylight as if preparing for a storm no one else could see. Syra cleaned the living room, hiding the suitcase behind the curtain. I changed the bandage on Meher's lip with cotton from our medicine box. Ilyas sat at the kitchen table drawing a crooked house with 4 people inside it. When I asked who they were, he said it was a family that did not shout. The words landed so softly that they hurt more than any scream. Outside, the sun moved across the windows, turning the floor gold. Life went on in the building. A pressure cooker whistled downstairs. Someone laughed in the stairwell. A delivery rider honked in the lane. But inside our apartment, every ordinary sound became a warning. By evening, Meher had stopped shaking enough to tell us pieces of her story. She had once wanted to be a teacher. She loved Urdu poetry and used to write verses in the margins of old newspapers. She had married young because her parents believed a respectable home was safer than an uncertain dream. For a while, she said, her husband had been charming. Then charm became control, control became suspicion, and suspicion became violence. She spoke without drama, almost quietly, the way people describe weather after living too long in a storm. Syra listened with tears in her eyes, but I found myself unable to look away from Ilyas, who had fallen asleep with a mango stain on his shirt and one hand still holding a broken blue crayon. At 7, the first knock came. It was not loud, but it stole the breath from the room. Syra froze by the sink. Meher pulled Ilyas close so quickly he woke with a gasp. I walked to the door feeling as if the hallway had stretched for miles. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a man in a pressed shirt standing beneath the flickering bulb. His hair was neat, his face calm, his posture polite. That frightened me more than rage would have. Monsters in real life do not always arrive wild-eyed and shouting. Sometimes they arrive clean, controlled, and smiling as if they are owed entry into every room. I opened the door only halfway. He introduced himself as Arman Malik and said he was looking for his wife. His voice was smooth, almost tired, like a man inconvenienced by someone else's foolishness. He said she was unwell, confused, emotional, and that a child should not be dragged into a woman's bad mood. Behind me, I felt the entire apartment holding its breath. I told him he had the wrong place. He glanced over my shoulder, and for a second his eyes sharpened. Then Ilyas, brave without understanding bravery, stepped into the edge of the hallway light. Meher's hand flew to her mouth. Arman smiled. That child, he said, looked familiar. Something in me changed then. Fear was still there, but beneath it came an old anger, one I had buried since childhood. I remembered being 7 years old, standing between my mother and my father, believing my small body could stop a grown man's cruelty. I remembered failing. I remembered promising myself that when I grew up, would never stand silent in a doorway again. So I smiled back at Arman and said the boy was my nephew, visiting with my cousin, and that if he had lost his family, he should call the police instead of frightening strangers in apartment buildings. My voice did not shake. That surprised me. Arman stared at me for a long moment. Then he leaned closer and whispered that people should be careful about involving themselves in private matters. His breath smelled of mint. His eyes carried the confidence of someone who had been believed too many times. I told him private matters ended when someone was afraid for their life. His smile disappeared. From inside the apartment, Syra suddenly began speaking loudly, laughing as if we were all gathered for dinner, asking my cousin whether Ilyas wanted more rice. It was a performance, clumsy and desperate, but it worked for one precious second. A neighbor opened his door down the hall to see what was happening. Arman noticed. Men like him love closed doors and silent corridors. Witnesses are daylight, and daylight weakens them. He left, but not before saying he would come back. After the door closed, Meher collapsed to the floor without making a sound. Syra knelt beside her, and I stood there with my hand still on the lock, shaking so hard I could hear the keys rattling. I wanted to call the police immediately, but Meher begged us not to do it without a plan. She said Arman had friends, influence, a cousin in uniform, a way of twisting every story until she became unstable and he became patient. That was the worst part of fear, not just the danger itself, but the knowledge that the world might ask you to prove your wounds before it believed you deserved saving. Saira remembered a retired lawyer who lived 2 floors below, Mrs. Varda Saeed, a widow with silver hair and a voice sharp enough to cut lies in half. We went to her together, leaving Meher and Ilyas inside with the chain lock fastened. Mrs. Varda listened without interrupting. Then she put on her glasses, pulled out an old notebook, and began making calls. Not dramatic calls, not cinematic ones, but practical, steady calls to people who knew what to do. A women's protection officer. A trustworthy police contact. A shelter supervisor. A clinic. She told us fear feeds on confusion, and the first thing we had to do was make a record, make noise, make it impossible for Arman to drag Meher back into silence. The next hour felt like walking through fire with our eyes open. Meher gave her statement while crying so quietly that it broke something in everyone who heard her. Saira held Ilyas in the kitchen and taught him how to make paper boats from grocery receipts. I brewed tea no one drank. Mrs. Varda sat beside Meher like a wall made of bone and justice. Every few minutes, sounds from outside made us flinch. The apartment, once small and shabby, began to feel like a fragile fortress. It was not much, but it was ours, and for that one night, it stood between a woman and the man who believed her life belonged to him. Arman returned after sunset, just as the sky outside turned purple and the daytime heat finally began to fade. This time he was not alone. 2 men stood behind him. He pounded on the door and shouted Meher's name. Ilyas screamed. Meher covered his ears. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might tear through my chest. But before I could move, Mrs. Varda stepped forward, opened the door with the chain still fastened, and spoke to Arman as if he were a student who had failed an easy lesson. She told him his wife had given a statement, that officers were on their way, that neighbors were watching, and that if he took one step inside, his respectable life would become very public by morning. For the first time, Arman looked afraid. Not sorry. Not ashamed. Afraid. There is a difference. The hallway filled with doors opening, faces appearing, whispers rising. People who had spent years minding their own business suddenly understood that sometimes minding your own business is how cruelty survives. The pharmacy owner came up from downstairs. The old man from 3B stood with his walking stick. Someone began recording on a phone. Arman looked around at all those witnesses, all that unwanted daylight, even though it was already night, and his power shrank in front of us. When the officers arrived, everything happened faster than I expected and slower than Meher deserved. There were questions, documents, warnings, calls, arrangements. Arman denied everything with wounded pride, but Meher did not lower her eyes anymore. She held Ilyas with one arm and gave the officer the medical photos Saira had helped her save earlier at the center. Mrs. Varda stood beside her. I stood behind them both, not as a hero, not as someone fearless, but as someone who had finally understood that pretending had only been the beginning. We had pretended for a few hours so Meher could stop pretending for the rest of her life. By midnight, Meher and Ilyas were taken safely to a protected shelter. Before leaving, Ilyas ran back into the apartment and handed me the drawing of the crooked house. He had added more people to it now. There was a woman with silver hair, a girl with long braids who looked like Saira, a tall man he said was me, and a sun above the roof even though the sky in the drawing was dark. He said houses could keep the sun inside if the people were kind. I did not know what to say, so I hugged him, and he hugged me back with the complete trust only children are brave enough to give. Weeks passed. Meher began the long process of rebuilding. It was not perfect. Real healing never is. There were court dates, panic attacks, money problems, nights when she almost believed she had made a mistake because freedom can feel terrifying after years in a cage. But Syra visited her often. Mrs. Varda helped with paperwork. I brought books for Ilias from the shop, and one afternoon, in full daylight, Meher came to our apartment wearing a yellow scarf and carrying a notebook. She had started writing again. Her hands still trembled sometimes, but her voice had changed. It had roots now. Months later, Meher became an assistant teacher at a small school near the shelter. Ilias learned to laugh loudly, the kind of laugh that fills corners and scares sadness away. Syra kept volunteering, but she no longer came home carrying pain alone. And I, who had once believed kindness was small, learned that kindness can be a locked door, a witness in a hallway, a mango cut into uneven slices, a stranger saying you are safe here and meaning it. I also learned that second chances do not always arrive as romance, money, or miracles. Sometimes they arrive as people willing to stand beside you when the world tells them to look away. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Ancient Truth. Your kindness in engaging with this story may help it reach someone who is silently waiting for a sign that they are not alone. Special request, please comment, kindness can save a life, if you believe no one should have to suffer in silence. Years later, I still keep Ilias's drawing folded inside my favorite book. The paper has softened at the edges, and the crayon sun has faded, but every time I look at it, I remember that ordinary afternoon when I walked into my apartment with groceries and found fear sitting on my sofa. I remember Syra's trembling voice saying we needed to pretend tonight. And I remember the truth we discovered before morning came. Sometimes people pretend to be strong until someone gives them permission to be human, and sometimes a small apartment, filled with scared people choosing courage, becomes the place where a life begins again.